I have prepared a formal talk that will be accompanied by the slideshow. And let me start with this slide, which is an auto da fe. I'll come to speak about an auto da fe soon. But let me begin with, again, 1492. 1492 was a pivotal year in the history of Spain, and not only because Christopher Columbus found lands unknown to the Europeans on the far side of the Atlantic. 1492 also saw the completion of the reconquest by Christians of Muslim strongholds in Spain, followed in the same year by the expulsion and conversion of the Jewish population of Spain. Many Jews left for neighboring Portugal, where they were forcibly converted just 4 years later. By the turn of the century, therefore, the Iberian Peninsula was officially without Jews. The inhabitants were all Christians, or, as former Jews were labeled, new Christians, viewed with suspicion by the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition, which had been established, at least the Spanish Inquisition, before to fight heresy. In the wake of Columbus's voyages and the Spanish conquest of the Americas, people of Jewish descent started settling in Spain's American colonies, usually for economic reasons, although some may have been drawn to a world far away from inquisitorial persecution. These settlers ignored the instruction by Queen Isabella to the governor of the first Spanish colony in the Americas, Santo Domingo, that no Jews, Moors, or heretics be admitted. 7 years later, this ban also encompassed their descendants, the descendants of Jews, therefore. But the bureaucracy was too thinly spread and distances too enormous for such measures to be effective. New Christians leaving Spain from Seville disguised themselves as soldiers or priests who required no license, or by illegally acquiring licenses for shipment to the American colonies. Despite the obvious dangers, some of them tried to keep professing the former religion in the colonies. We are not talking here about a sizable group. And this led King Philip II in 1569 to issue a decree that established seats of the Inquisition in Spanish America, which appeared in the next few years in both Mexico and Peru. The inquisitors were to be appointed by and responsible to the king. Their task was to find out whether colonial populations had in their midst people who strayed from Catholic orthodoxy. So-called Judaizers could be punished if they were to invoke or consult the devil, if they were to say that Jesus Christ was a mere man and that his mother was not a virgin, and if they were to possess the Talmud or other prohibited Jewish books. Those found guilty of Judaizing were sometimes condemned in public spectacles called autos da fe, such as the one right here, although this is one from Madrid in 1680, but there was a famous one, for instance, in Mexico City in 1596. It is hard to distinguish between descendants of Jews who hid their Judaism and those who were genuine Christians. Both groups were known as New Christians, even many generations after their conversion. These New Christians were not just important in Mexico, where I just mentioned this auto da fe, but even more so in South America, where they came to control a good part of the commodity flow between Brazil and Europe. At the same time, they also became heavily involved in the African slave trade controlled at this point by Portugal. In Europe, the new Christian presence was hardly important in the port of Antwerp, but particularly important in the port of Antwerp in what is today Belgium, a port that was briefly Europe's main commercial center. New Christian merchants settling in Antwerp enjoyed a special asset, which was their excellent relations with the Portuguese crown, which practically monopolized the spice trade. In 1580, Spain annexed its Portuguese neighbor, which gave rise to the so-called Crown Union between the two countries. This Crown Union enabled Portuguese New Christian merchants to cross the Spanish border and infiltrate the Spanish trade with the Americas. Portuguese merchants or their agents settled in key parts of Spanish America, such as Panama, Lima, Buenos Aires, and Cartagena de Indias. It is, of course, by no means true that these men were all Judaizers. Probably we're talking about a small minority. Nor did they work within entirely new Christian networks. Still, the growing presence of new Christians brought the Spanish Inquisition into play, most famously in Lima, where an alleged conspiracy in 1639 resulted in a massive auto da fe. The mid-17th century was a traumatic period for American New Christians, many of whom were prosecuted for Judaizing, which was often a pretext used by the Inquisition for going after the fortunes of wealthy men, since the notoriously cash-strapped Inquisition would keep the goods confiscated from convicted prisoners. The judicial persecution of many New Christians inevitably led to a significant reduction in Judaizing tendencies and to assimilation of descendants of Jews into old Christian society, especially in Peru and later also in Mexico. Portugal had its own Inquisition, which was also prosecuting New Christians suspected of Judaizing, scores of whom left their native soil in large numbers and moved to Northern Europe. The migrants' destination was no longer primarily Antwerp by the end of the 16th century, which was losing its significance as an international trading hub, but to ports such as Hamburg and Amsterdam. Once there, and here's the synagogue in Amsterdam that is still standing today, which once was the largest synagogue in the world. Once there in Amsterdam and places like Hamburg, they often reverted to their ancestral religion, professing Judaism freely. In the Spanish Empire, Crypto-Judaism declined but did not disappear. Against all odds, some men and women of Jewish descent kept trying to observe the religious injunctions of their ancestral faith. Fasting in Jewish culture, which could express repentance, reflection, but also accompanied the remembrance of important events in Jewish history, was at times hard to cover up. Among the subterfuges that crypto-Jews, hidden Jews, secret Jews, used to conceal fasting was to send their servants on lengthy errands at dinner time. Perhaps the clearest marker of the Judaic faith of the New Christians was the celebration of the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, Judaizers tried to observe the requirement not to work, the fourth commandment. In Brazil, for instance, a school teacher was denounced in 1593 because, quote, on Saturdays he did not hold class and he ordered his students not to come to class. More often, probably, Judaizers could not afford to abstain from work out of fear of being discovered or because they simply needed the money. At times, they compromised by working intermittently. These glimpses of Judaizing New Christians we obtain from the files of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, which are rich but also problematic, because it is by no means clear that the confessions of Judaizers or accusations made against them were true. It could be argued that they were, as one historian has written, the byproduct of inquisitorial procedure or anti-Judaic prejudice. The practices that I have referred to were included in a whole range of rites and observances that were considered Judaic by the Portuguese and Spanish Inquisition. That these stereotypical attributes were confirmed by the accused in their confessions does not necessarily mean that they were true, and not only because some statements were extracted by torture. The accused would pay a heavy price for denying the charges against him or her if the inquisitors deemed them proven. In that case, refusing to make a confession would prevent the alleged Judaizer from being reconciled with the church or readmitted into the Christian community. Those found guilty who did not make a complete confession faced the same consequences. They were therefore often eager to denounce the people whom the inquisitors considered their accomplices. Therefore, it's wrong to infer from the many confessions obtained by the Inquisition that crypto-Judaism was a widespread phenomenon, just as it is incorrect to take the thousands of confessions made by imputed witches in early modern Europe at face value. According to some historians, the unintended consequences of this targeting by the Inquisition of people with only a tenuous connection with the Jewish past was that they had to rely more on the new Christian community than before, which made it more likely for them to reconnect with their Judaic culture, all the more since they were alienated from the Catholicism that they had professed. In this way, persecution by the Inquisition reactivated old traditions. At least, that is what happened in some cases. Generally, however, these victims of the Inquisition had no experience of Jewish life at all. And to think that after their distressing encounter with the Inquisition, they would become part of a new Christian community where Judaizing was the norm would also be a mistake. Those communities were largely imagined, not by Jews or New Christians, but by the Inquisition. The assumption of scholars who believe in the existence of those communities is that individuals derive their identity from belonging to that community, which nurtured their Judaizing tendencies. For those New Christians in the Iberian Peninsula looking for an authentically Jewish community, possibilities did open up in Northern Europe and across the ocean, starting in the 1590s when Amsterdam became a destination for a growing number of Portuguese merchants and their families. And here you have an image of Florianburg, which was a neighborhood in 17th century Amsterdam where probably most Jews lived, most Portuguese Jews lived. For Judaizers, one attractive feature of this Dutch port was the toleration they enjoyed, as well as the right to establish synagogues and Jewish schools and bury their dead in a Jewish cemetery. Of course, not all of the Portuguese immigrants were or became Jewish. Some were old Christians who had no demonstrable Jewish ancestors. Others were New Christians but opted not to convert to Judaism. Wary of both the Inquisition, but likewise of the strict leadership of the local Jewish community, these people preferred to be left alone. What they all had in common is that they belonged to the so-called Portuguese nation, which had its own customs and interests. One conspicuous feature of the men of the Portuguese nation was their mobility. They moved around in Europe and frequently sailed across the Atlantic in an age when seaborne voyages were notoriously hazardous. From their new abode in Amsterdam, the Portuguese New Christians, many of them converted now to Judaism, contributed in a significant manner to the Dutch Golden Age. Their niche was the trade with Portugal and its colonial empire, from where they received a wide array of luxury products, including Indian diamonds and Brazilian sugar, in exchange for wheat, grain, and other goods from Northern Europe. Amsterdam came also to be connected to Brazil in the early years of the 17th century, when both planters and merchants from Brazil settled in the Dutch port and converted to Judaism. They had often been involved in exporting Brazilian sugar to Amsterdam, and now their commercial ties facilitated a return to their ancestral faith. But most of the so-called new Jews settling in Amsterdam arrived not from Brazil, but from Portugal. A large number of them openly lobbied for the conquest by the Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621 as part of the war effort of the Dutch against Spain, the independence war of the Dutch Republic. So a large number of them openly lobbied for the conquest by this Dutch West India Company, and here you see the headquarters in Amsterdam, the conquest of Brazil. And many more of them moved to Dutch Brazil, and here we have an idea of Dutch Brazil in the 1630s. It started in that year itself, 1629, 1630, when among the soldiers on board of the conquering expedition of Dutch Brazil were at least 40 Iberian and 20 German Jews. It was in Dutch Brazil where the first Jewish congregations of the Americas were established, in the city of Recife and the twin city of Mauritsstad, named for the governor of Dutch Brazil. The Judaizers who arrived returned to full religious and cultural Jewish life by copying institutions that had recently been established in Amsterdam. Here's another image of the twin cities of Mauritsstad. You can see it here, the Stad Mauritius and Recife. So after 1630, Portuguese men already residing in Brazil also could take up Judaism by crossing over to the Dutch part of Brazil. But the conditions also allowed a movement in the opposite direction by enabling new Jews to actually return to Catholicism. Several cases are known of new Christians resident in Brazil who became Jews after 1630, only to return to Catholicism at a later date. One example is the Portuguese-born Pedro de Almeida, 3 of whose 4 grandparents had been new Christians. This man lived as a teenager in Brazil and tried to return to Portugal at the age of 17 when his ship was captured by the Dutch. In Recife, Where he was disembarked, he was persuaded by a distant cousin of his mother to adopt Judaism and learn the prayers and rituals of a pious Jew. He hesitated, however, and when he was about to leave for the Dutch Republic to be circumcised, he expressed his desire to go back to Catholicism. His relatives convinced him to refrain from making this move, and he was then circumcised locally by the cousin's brother. 3 years later, however, he did abandon Judaism altogether. Other New Christians flirted, so to speak, with Judaism without making a complete conversion. Among the settlers of Dutch Brazil was a man named Aaron Serfati, the first Portuguese Jews to be circumcised in Amsterdam in 1597. In 1653, he was elected president of the Tzur Israel congregation of Recife. Another settler of Dutch Brazil was a man named David Abravanel Dormido, a New Christian who had been a treasurer for the Spanish king Philip IV, but who was convicted in Spain for Judaizing. With his wife and daughter, he spent 5 years in an Inquisition prison before his release in 1632. Via France, he made his way to Amsterdam, where he settled in 1640 before finally moving on to Brazil. While these are success stories, there were also numerous poor men and women among the Jewish settlers arriving from Amsterdam. By 1645, one community leader in Brazil complained about, quote, the extreme poverty of the Jewish nation. Even respectable persons, he argued, had resigned themselves to live on charity. Economic opportunities had attracted these ocean-crossing Jews, but equally important were the privileges that they looked forward to enjoying on the far side of the ocean. The Dutch government in Brazil guaranteed freedom of conscience for the Jews and allowed them, as I mentioned before, to open the first synagogue in the history of the Americas. The decade of the 1640s was a tumultuous one on both sides of the Atlantic for Jews. Portugal declared its independence from Spain, starting a long war that was eventually crowned with success. And in Brazil, Portuguese settlers rebelled against Dutch rule, reducing the area under Dutch control and enabling, ultimately, in 1654, the defeat of the Dutch colony. The rebellion of the Portuguese planters in 1645 rocked the foundations of the world of Dutch Jewry. Economically and emotionally, the events were such a shock that it would take them many years to recover. The news of the rebellion led Brazil's Jews to collect an impressive sum of money to be distributed to the Dutch soldiers. Such generosity did not prevent the sad fate that awaited several Jews at the hands of the Portuguese. Immediately after the start of the revolt, local Portuguese residents killed 3 Jews, while 2 others were caught and hanged on the same day that 2 more Jews were captured elsewhere, baptized, and killed. Several others were arrested and sent to Lisbon, where the Inquisition tried them. One of them was condemned to die, but those who could prove that they were born Jews were eventually released. As the persecution grew, the Dutch government ordered in an unambiguous statement that went far beyond the guarantee of tolerance that the Jews who remained in Dutch Brazil were to receive protection from any damage to person or property. Although that rebellion against Dutch rule was a big blow to the Jewish inhabitants, numerous Jews in Amsterdam continued to associate the New World with hope. Among religious Jews, the hope for redemption and the prayer for the coming of the Messiah was almost a daily ritual. Without their belief in the imminence of the Messiah, they would have abandoned Judaism. Messianism was given an important new impulse by a one-time resident of Dutch Brazil, Antonio de Montesinos. In 1644, Montesinos arrived in Amsterdam to tell Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel the story of his meeting with South American Indians, whom he took for Hebrew-speaking Jews and members of the 10 lost tribes. The Rabbi Manasseh believed this was the sign that the coming of the Messiah was near. In planning new settlements in England and the Americas, especially for the persecuted Jews from Iberia and Poland, Manasseh ben Israel revealed his practical and his messianic side. Such migration, he hoped, would accelerate the dispersal of Jews all over the globe, which was a precondition of the coming of the Messiah. He expounded his views in the book Hope of Israel, which was published in 1650, a work that attracted a large following. The Jewish community of Curaçao took the book's Hebrew title, Mikveh Israel, as its name. The names of the congregations of Bridgetown, Barbados, Spacetown, Barbados, New Amsterdam, and Newport, Rhode Island also expressed the belief that the worldwide scattering of Jews was to precede the ingathering. What helped Manasseh's ideas gain currency was that he resided in Amsterdam, which was sometimes called the Jerusalem of the West, a city whose Jewish congregation developed into the mother community of most Jewish settlements that sprang up in the Americas. Jews in Brazil, Guyana, the Caribbean, and North America returned to full religious and cultural Jewish life by copying institutions that had recently been established in Amsterdam. The 1638 Askamot, the bylaws of the Amsterdam congregation, were the archetype for all 17th century congregations in the New World. In Barbados and Curaçao, even a number of articles, 42, followed the Dutch original. The Amsterdam communal leaders spent thousands of guilders to sponsor Jewish migration to new colonies such as Essequibo. Smaller sums were spent on migration to Cayenne and Curaçao. And as you can see on this slide, the congregation also donated Torah scrolls to various new communities on the other side of the ocean. I could talk about every single colony where Jews settled in the wake of the loss of Brazil, but let me single out one that I have recently studied in depth, and that is Cayenne, today's French Guiana. Cayenne was located on what the Dutch in the 17th century called the Wild Coast, the tropical area between the Orinoco Delta and Brazil, where Northern Europeans established numerous settlements, some of which proved to last. For the Dutch colony of Cayenne, a Christian merchant in Amsterdam took the initiative. Knowing that the French had left Cayenne behind and that there were many unoccupied lands on the wild coast, this merchant approached the Dutch government in 1655 with a request to establish a colony there. The area, he said, was suitable for growing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other crops. A few years after this Christian man and Christian settlers had pioneered the Dutch colony, a group of Jewish migrants, probably all Sephardim, led by their patroon, David Nassi, who had traveled, arrived in Cayenne. These Jewish passengers wanted to settle, as had been promised, on the peninsula of Cayenne, but upon their arrival, the commander of the colony denied them that right. After complaints from the Jewish settlers eventually reached the West India Company headquarters in Amsterdam, the commander was ordered to allocate the Jews their promised lands, which he finally did. The Jewish leader, David Nassi, had moved as a young adult from Portugal to Amsterdam, the city that was a springboard for him and so many other Jews and crypto-Jews to Dutch Brazil. In Brazil, he worked as a merchant and he bought a sugar mill, which he would lose when the Dutch surrendered the colony in 1654. On that occasion, together with hundreds of other Jews, Nassi returned to Amsterdam, but there was not enough room for them, where many of them were bound to live in dire poverty. Nassi took it upon himself to find a new home on the other side of the ocean. That was facilitated by the quest of the West India Company to populate newly acquired overseas colonies. And their deliberations with Nassi first resulted in the establishment of a colony called Nova Zelandia, also on the Guyana, the wild coast. In 1657, Nassi entered into a contract with the province of Zeeland, which enabled him to set up an agricultural colony there with other Jews. That the colony was premised on the production of tropical crops is evident from the initiative that Nassi took shortly afterwards to procure slaves on the African coast. The privileges that Nassi received for the Jewish colony in 1657 included the use of a synagogue, schools, and a cemetery, and they did not have to appear in court on the Sabbath and on Jewish holidays. Nassi and some of his fellow believers in Amsterdam took various measures to enable the colony to succeed, and also he took the initiative to start a colony in Cayenne. Nassi did not stand out for his wealth. In fact, He was an average taxpayer within Amsterdam's Jewish community. Most of the other Amsterdam Jews who served as financial backers of the new colony in Cayenne, which was established by Jews soon after Nova Zelandia, were even on the poor side. Their modest capital contrasted with the wealth of the man mentioned here on the slide, Abraham Cohen, another underwriter of the colony. Cohen, who had lived in Dutch Brazil for nearly 20 years and was since nicknamed Do Brasil, from Brazil, of Brazil, all indications are that he was the West India Company's leading bondholder. Along with the other underwriters, Cohen may have been motivated in part by the belief that the coming of the Jewish Messiah was near, which would entail the restoration of the sovereignty of the Jewish people. Establishing colonies in the spirit of Manasseh ben Israel would speed up the global dispersal of Jews, which was seen again as a precondition of the coming of the Messiah. The ship that carried the first Jews to Cayenne bore the name the Promised Land, het Land van Belofte in Dutch, a likely reference to these messianic beliefs. Unlike Cohen, the third man on this slide, Abraham Drago, had few assets, and yet he was deeply involved in the planning of Jewish colonies. Born in Lisbon, Drago had migrated to Dutch Brazil in 1648, but soon returned to Amsterdam, where he championed the new Jewish settlement in Curaçao. In fact, he himself was one of the first Jewish settlers of that island, arriving there with 3 non-Jewish men who would work for him. In 1660, Drago did something similar for Cayenne, although he never himself settled in that colony. After the French conquered Cayenne in 1664, most of the Jews took advantage of the offer of the French conquerors to submit to French rule while maintaining their privileges. Other Jews moved back to the Dutch Republic, while some settled in Barbados and in Jamaica. The Jews who remained in Cayenne witnessed yet another conquest 2 years later, this time by an English force, which took them to Suriname, which was still under English rule. And here you can see a Jewish settlement in Suriname called Jodensavanne, a Jewish savannah, which was basically the headquarters of the largest Jewish agricultural settlement at that point in the entire world. Another year later, this same group experienced yet another changing of the guard when a squadron from the Dutch Republic captured Suriname. There the Jews continued the tropical agriculture they had begun in Nova Zelandia and in Cayenne. David Nassi, along with his son Samuel, became the leader of this Jewish community of Suriname, while in Amsterdam, Abraham Drago continued where he left off with Cayenne, supporting the new colony in all possible ways. Jews also began to move to the English islands in the Caribbean, and did so around the same time that they were welcome again in England. England had expelled its Jews in the year 1290, and even though some Judaizers are known to have lived there in subsequent centuries, there was still no legal basis for their presence in the mid-17th century. Manasseh ben Israel actually played a role in encouraging the English leader Oliver Cromwell to readmit Jews. In the face of opposition from both merchants who feared Jewish competition and some clergymen who expected blasphemy from Jewish immigrants, Cromwell took no formal action, but resident Jews, who all hailed from the Iberian Peninsula, went ahead and started organizing their community by renting a room that would be used as a synagogue and buying a plot of land for use as a cemetery. That was the start of a new chapter of Jewish life in England. The readmission of Jews to England would in due course enable London to become the second mother community for Atlantic Jewry after Amsterdam. That was in part a consequence of the migration of large numbers of Jews from Amsterdam to England, which happened for 2 reasons. England had become a chief trading partner of Portugal, where many Amsterdam Jews obviously had good contacts, and the second reason, residing in England gave them access to English islands in the Caribbean, in particular Barbados and Jamaica, colonies that offered prospective European immigrants a tempting perspective. The exodus from Dutch Brazil also led to the French islands in the Caribbean of Martinique and Guadeloupe. A large contingent of Jews and Dutch Christians made their way to Martinique, where the Jewish priests convinced the owner of the island that these foreigners should be barred because they would only introduce heresy and Judaism in the colony. So refused entrance, these refugees continued their travels and landed at Guadeloupe, whose proprietor was less scrupulous. More than 900 persons, including 500 slaves, disembarked. Later, Jews were also allowed to settle on Martinique, but by order of King Louis XIV, they were all expelled from these islands in 1685. In the American colonies where Jews settled, they would dedicate themselves to trade and tropical agriculture. Although anti-Jewish legislation never disappeared, Jewish life in slave societies was relatively untroubled, as the rule by a European minority over an enslaved black majority spawned what we might call a pragmatic solidarity among the Europeans that allowed Jews to become white. As we've seen, the first stage of what we might call the Americanization of Jewry was all about Jews who hailed from the Iberian Peninsula, Sephardim Portuguese Jews, either directly or through their ancestors, they were Jews. Ashkenazi Jews could be found in some of the English and Dutch colonies in the later 17th century, but they were still few and far between at that point in time. From the Dutch Republic and from England, Jews moved in fairly sizable numbers across the Atlantic. And we should not think of these new Jews as set apart from the rest of the colonial societies in which they settled. On the one hand, they were of course religiously different, and the first generation hardly spoke the local language, especially the lower classes, which did make them different. Only members of the commercial elites were still able to speak Dutch or English. On the other hand, they often teamed up with Christians in their economic endeavors, and as more Jews were born in the adopted fatherlands of their parents, their ability to communicate in the local vernaculars increased. Few new Jews had any knowledge of Hebrew, which was reserved for prayer and Torah study by the rabbinic elites in both Amsterdam and England, but also in the Dutch and English colonies. We know less of the colonial communities that emerged in the mid-17th century in the Americas, especially regarding lower class Jews, but the situation was probably similar. One difference between the Atlantic Jewish communities was that in some, such as Suriname, all Portuguese Jews settling in the colony were automatically considered members of the Jewish community and thereby subject to its laws. What distinguished these Jews, the Jews of Suriname, the colony with the largest Jewish population in the Americas by the late 18th century, followed by Curaçao and Jamaica, was that, different from their Christian neighbors, Jews tended to remain in the colony. Return migration to the Dutch Republic was conspicuously small. The unusual stability this entailed contributed to communal longevity that became a source of pride and signaled rootedness. So Suriname and Curaçao, by the late 18th century, are still the largest Jewish communities in the Americas, and by far. Let me just say a few words about Curaçao, which I've skipped, even though I've dealt with it quite extensively in the past. Going back to the middle of the 17th century, a native of Portugal, who had also lived in Dutch Brazil, became the very first Jewish settler of Curaçao. And here you see Curaçao's beautiful synagogue and the interior of the synagogue. So this man, the first Jewish settler of Curaçao, João de Jan, was only allowed to cultivate fruit and other produce, which limited his options. But it may have been very hard to live up to the agreement he made anyway, because the soil of the island was and is very arid. Entire years could pass by without a single drop of rain. Nor did this man have any experience as a planter. Instead, he had always been a merchant, with contacts extending to Portugal, Brazil, and Angola. Now, on Curaçao, he started importing horses and supplying flour and clothing to the soldiers and officials of the Dutch West India Company on the island. And the trend that he started was continued by other Jews who arrived from Amsterdam. In due course, commercial ties were forged with Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, and the Spanish-American mainland, but initially Curaçao's Jews had no choice but to sell goods to the Dutch West India Company. The ever-growing Jewish population played a key role in transforming the island of Curaçao from a sleepy backwater into one of the leading ports in the Americas by 1700. Before too long, many, and perhaps even most merchants and ship owners, were Jews who made full use of their particular advantages, that is, their mastery of the Spanish language, and their family networks across the Atlantic with various relatives acting as business associates. The vast majority of the cocoa, tobacco, hides, and other shipments sent by Curaçaoan Jews to Amsterdam were consigned to other Jews, as I mentioned, quite often members of the same family. On the European side of the Atlantic, Jews benefited from the activities of their American co-religionists by setting up sugar refineries and tobacco workshops. Some merchants themselves became involved in these industries and had an obvious advantage over competitors who bought their materials wholesale. Sugar refining appeared on the Portuguese Jewish scene rather suddenly in the mid-1650s, when the first refinery was founded in 1655 by Abraham and Isaac Pereira. In that same year, the municipal authorities of Amsterdam overruled the protests of Dutch Christian sugar refiners and declared sugar refining open to Jewish entrepreneurs. Most of these refineries remained in Portuguese Jewish hands for only relatively short periods of time, though. If for the Jews of the Americas, at the same time, European markets were essential for their livelihoods, Europe was also important for the establishment and maintenance of Jewish religious communities in the Americas, whether it was through the shipment of the Torah scrolls, as we have seen, and engraved gravestones and the selection of rabbis, of chazans. Many different reasons account for this. Amsterdam and London functioned as mother communities of these Jewish congregations in the Caribbean and later also in North America. In 1757, for example, the congregation Sheret Israel of New York wrote a letter to the Mahamad, the Council of Communal Elders of London, asking for a chazan who should be, quote, a young man of morals and strictly religious, with the advantage of an agreeable voice and a capacity for teaching of Hebrew and translating it into English as well as Spanish, to read prayers and to teach poor boys for a salary of £50. The Mahamad agreed to look for a candidate, but they asked whether the £50 included extras, without which the post would be somewhat unattractive. They also insisted that the chazan's passage and expenses be paid and the agreement be made for a specified number of years. Furthermore, they said, since it was late in the season, nobody could go out before the spring. The answer from New York was, we have no objection to a married man, but would choose one rather with a small family and not attended with much charge, as our congregation is small and few that are able to contribute to the support thereof. There was still a lot of poverty. Apart from Amsterdam and London, other European towns also developed close ties to Jewish America. Take, for example, the southern French port of Bayonne, which is located in the southwestern corner of France, very close to Spain. Bayonne was the place that may not even ring a bell. Here you have a beautiful 18th century image of the city. Starting in the middle of the 16th century, new Christians had settled on the French coast, coming from Spain and Portugal, where Jews, of course, had been expelled or forced to live as Christians. Once in Bayonne, they received privileges, not as Jews, but as Portuguese merchants, although by 1723, openly identifying Jews received the same privileges. Both those who remained Christians and those embracing Judaism played a large role in transatlantic commerce, often through networks that tied them to relatives in the French colonies. Through their cocoa imports from the Americas, they helped the quickly growing chocolate industry of Bayonne. Located between, on the one hand, the Iberian Peninsula, and on the other hand, new Jewish centers such as Amsterdam, London, and Hamburg, Bayonne was also a midway point from a religious point of view. It developed into a site where new Christians became Jews before moving on to places where Jews could move freely and profess their religion in all liberty, not just in Europe, but all over the Americas. So here is a list of the places where Jews from Bayonne settled: Curaçao, Martinique, Jamaica, Barbados, St. Eustatius, even Nova Scotia is among them. And sometimes the ships that they sent were underlined by a reference to their Jewishness, such as the King David. In the 17th century, a number of Jews from Bayonne settled in Martinique, where they bought land and slaves and planted crops such as cocoa. In the 18th century, Jews from Bayonne lived in Jamaica, Suriname, and Curaçao. In those places, people from Bayonne often married each other and cherished the memory of the city from which they hailed. In fact, in their wills, they often bequeathed money to relatives in Bayonne or the poor there. That overseas Jews did not forget the native ground of Bayonne is shown also by the case of one Jamaican Jew, Abraham Pereira Mesquita, who instructed his father, who still lived in Bayonne, to buy for him a country property, quote, in the land where he wished to return to make his home. But unfortunately for him, he died before he could enjoy his retirement. So, Abraham Pereira Mesquita was one of the many Jews who found a new abode in the Americas, where Jewish males were active in the pursuits in which they had generally been tolerated for centuries, especially trade and brokerage. Different, though, from many parts of Europe, Jews were allowed to own land in the Dutch and English colonies, where the more prosperous among them became planters. In both capacities, as merchants and planters, they did not completely leave Europe behind. As in the case of Bayonne, their wills reveal lasting bonds tying them together with fellow Jews an ocean away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very useful. Can I ask about the archives that you were using in France, particularly in Bayonne, because I'm sort of vaguely aware that there were Western Sephardim in some places like Saint-Domingue, so Haiti, and so on, but don't know any of the details. Or are you getting it from the sort of Dutch notarial archives or elsewhere?
Well, certainly I come across contacts with Bayonne all the time in the Dutch notarial archives, not just Bayonne, but also places like Rouen. So it's not always the more obvious places like Bordeaux
Yeah.
or Saint-Malo or Nantes. The places where you find a group of new Christians on the French coast, such as Rouen, such as Bayonne, are places where Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam clearly trade a lot with. Well, I'm basing this mostly, however, on the literature. So there are people who've looked into these Jews of Bayonne, and it's supplemented by whatever I found in the Dutch archives. So there is some literature on this. But you mentioned the notarial archives of Amsterdam, which are incredibly rich. And what I'm working on, you mentioned it briefly in the beginning, is it's actually not going to be a book on Jews specifically, but on 70 men in Amsterdam in 1667 who write a petition to the Dutch government. And I've become interested in these men. I'm writing what becomes eventually a collective biography, but I'm doing that largely by using the notarial archives of Amsterdam, because basically everything has been preserved, and at any given point in time there are dozens of notaries. And the advantage of the Amsterdam archives is that everything is notarized. So when there's a little incident in the street, people usually don't go to the authorities. Societies in those days were still largely self-police, but they do go to the notary just to have it known that this is what happened this morning or yesterday. And everything is notarized. So you can basically, by going through these notaries very systematically, day after day, year after year, you get a very rich idea of what local Amsterdam society looked like, but also what the trade connections were to the wider world. The drawback of the fact that everything's been preserved is that this type of research goes very slowly. It goes one notarial document at a time. So I must have seen already like 10 million pages, and I still have the idea that I'm in the very beginning of my research.
Yeah. Also, you, excuse me, you were describing a community largely, well, partly in religious terms, where it always seems to me that maybe we're looking at essentially an extended family or a network of extended families. Um, is that not fair? Because we were discussing before the meeting with members of my own family who were hauled up for the Inquisition in Spain. There seems to be no evidence that they were actually sort of secretly practicing any
Mm.
Judaism whatsoever. It's, possibly that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. There were in Portuguese Jews in Spain after Portugal had declared independence, or just having a roundup. This is rather a big picture stepping back. I mean, what do you think is the best way to understand this sort of transatlantic Western Sephardic diaspora community?
Well, I suppose like it's not specific, I think, to the Americas, but in this period, Jews are both an ethnicity and a religion. And when you look at the Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam, it's very clear that there are those who keep on being mentioned in the archives of the Jewish community for the sake of charity or for the sake of contributing tax money. And then there are also those who are perhaps considered Jews by Christians, but they themselves prefer not to commit to Judaism. So when they go to the notary, they try to present themselves, even after decades living in Amsterdam, as Portuguese, men of the Portuguese nation. And obviously, there were Portuguese in Amsterdam who were old Christians who had no Jewish ancestry. So the way I think about them is that there were those who were clearly religious Jews. There were those who, perhaps for practical reasons, for the sake of charity, wanted to be a member of the Jewish community. And then there were also those who were not considered fellow Christians by the Dutch, and them being Portuguese, of course, would have been an obstacle anyway because they were Catholics, which in this period, both before 1648, when the Dutch still fight the War of Independence with a Catholic country, and after 1648, Catholics are basically second-rate citizens in the Dutch Republic. So that is problematic in the eyes of, of the Christians, but they tend to be accepted as Portuguese. And it is a phenomenon that has not been covered well in the literature. You find references to these men, but even though the scholarship on Jewish Amsterdam in the 17th century is fantastic, this is a category of people who are often in the dark, who we know not a whole lot about, in part because they would never write about this phenomenon themselves, of course.
Mhm.
Yeah, I suppose though with the religious definition, given that they were keeping their distance from the Ashkenazi community, it's um, was a sort of religion within the Portuguese diaspora, but maybe that's a question for another time. Ton, do you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering about numbers. Do we know how many new Christians there were in Latin America, say 1600? Um, are there any statistics of near guesses that make sense?
No, there are no
Should we think
statistics.
hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands?
Um, oh, well, certainly thousands of new Christians, perhaps tens of thousands. There's we discussed this briefly before the recording started. There's a very interesting book by David Gitlitz called Secrecy and Deceit, which deals with the expressions of Judaism, even though they might be faint echoes in Spain and Portugal, but also in Mexico and in South America. in largely the 16th and 17th centuries. Those are the periods that he relies upon. And when you finish reading that book, the impression is very clearly that this was not a minor phenomenon. With the qualification that I mentioned during my talk, which is that we have to be very careful with talking about New Christians as Judaizers, because we might simply be replicating the language of the Inquisition and the imputations of the Inquisition. So New Christians doesn't mean we're talking about Judaizers. We know New Christians moved to the Americas. We know that it was already in the first decades of the settlement of the Americas a phenomenon. Otherwise, there would have been no mention of it by Queen Isabella. So, but there are obviously no counts. It becomes a problem at some point when the Spanish authorities in Spain fear that there is such a massive Portuguese presence in the Spanish colonies that there's even talk about expelling Portuguese from the colonies. The fear is in part that they might introduce heretical ideas. And that's an interesting moment because it's then reflected in the response of the authorities on the ground in the Spanish colonies, the local governors and the local audiencias, where it's very clear that the Portuguese are so well integrated into society, for instance, in Cuba in this period or in Buenos Aires, that it would be almost impossible to expel them all. And many of these Portuguese would have been New Christians. But numbers, no, I wouldn't dare to venture a guess.
Second question. In 1654, Jews were present in Brazil and practically nowhere else, maybe a few on Curaçao. And in 1660, they seemed to be everywhere. What declares the speed with which that happened? Or was it in the context of the Dutch colonialism or something that Jews did that was
Brazil.
More effective than others?
Well, I think we first of all, we should not underestimate Dutch Brazil as a first place in the Americas where Jews could live freely as Jews. And Jonathan Israel has written on this as well, I think very correctly, has emphasized how big a loss this was. Jews also live in Brazil till the bitter end. And yes, there was a return migration among some when the area under Dutch rule had been confined quite significantly after 1645, but they're there until the bitter end. And I just mentioned these Amsterdam notarial archives. When you go through them, you keep finding echoes of Dutch Brazil in the 1670s when somebody notarizes a document saying, in 1653, this is what we did in Dutch Brazil as Jews. So there is an emotional attachment to Brazil. And I think one way to think about what happened then after 1654 was the attempt to refound Dutch Brazil. You find in the Dutch archives, not just on the part of Jews, but also on the part of colonial planners, the term Second Brazil mentioned quite frequently. Suriname in the beginning is often called a Second Brazil. And Suriname, of course, becomes a colony just like Curaçao, where a very significant part of the population of European background is Jewish. So I think it's not a direct diaspora from Brazil that ends up in all these different places. There's the story that keeps coming back of the 23 Jews that, at least were briefly in New Amsterdam. Most people, Christians and Jews, who live in the Dutch colony in Brazil leave in 1654. There's a very small contingent that remains, that is still there decades later. Most of them probably would have assimilated as Catholics into Portuguese Brazil. But most Jews go back to Europe those who go back to the Dutch Republic often end up leaving for the new colonies, the new Dutch colonies. But by now, of course, Jews have been readmitted into England, and therefore Jews also begin leaving England for Jamaica, conquered by the English in 1655, just a year after the loss of Dutch Brazil, and Barbados, which was colonized a generation earlier by the English and which became a major site of sugar cultivation.
Mhm.
So it's not just one factor that's happening. There's a lot happening in the middle of the 17th century. So at the same time that we have these lengthy trials in places like Lima and Mexico and Cartagena de Indias against so-called Judaizers, but the question is very much, are these really Judaizers? But in a way, these trials seem to signal that whatever crypto-Jewish life was there is no longer going to be possible in the future. At the same time, these new avenues appear, and now it's a very different story because this is full Jewish life, religious and cultural.
I have one last remark, but before I go on, can you stop sharing your screen? Then we can see everyone's faces.
Okay, let me see. Let me see. How do I stop sharing?
It could be on the top of your screen.
Here we are. Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you. You showed the slide with David Nassi and Abraham Cohen do Brasil and Abraham Drago. It's a coincidence, but Abraham Drago was the brother-in-law of David Nassi. David Nassi had married Ribka Drago, and she was the sister of Abraham.
Yes, and the marriages between the Dragos and the Nassis go back a few generations even before.
Mhm. And Abraham Cohen do Brasil was one of the few Ashkenazim in Brazil and later in the Caribbean. Bernard Miller has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you for a fascinating talk. And there's a lot of information in there which I hadn't heard before. I've got another archival question, and that is, are the Inquisition archives for particularly Brazil, but anywhere in Latin America, as extensive as those in Spain and Portugal? And are they easily accessible? And I've got a couple of other very minor questions.
Yeah, well, let me start by saying that there was never an Inquisition in Brazil. So the Portuguese have Inquisitions in Portugal. There's one in Goa, in India, in the Indian Ocean. What did exist, though, were visits of the Portuguese Inquisition to Brazil, where information was gathered on the basis of which decisions were made. So that could then lead to Judaizers, people convicted of Judaism or at least suspected of Judaism, being sent to Lisbon and tried there. So
Okay.
that first off. Then the Inquisition archives I'm most familiar with in the Spanish colonies. There were three of them. There was the first two were established within years of each other in Mexico and Peru around 1570, both of them. And then I believe by 1620, the third was founded in Cartagena de Indias, which was the only one that was facing the Caribbean. And that one in Cartagena de Indias is known for two types of inquisitorial trials. One was those in the beginning of Protestant, usually Protestant mariners who had washed up somewhere on the coast of northern South America and who then would go into an inn and say things that were considered to be heretical. Later on, when Cartagena de Indias becomes such a major port importing African slaves, we find many trials of especially African women convicted of or suspected of witchcraft. And those are quite rich, the archives of Cartagena de Indias. The other ones, I've only seen certain documents of the ones in Mexico and Peru, and they're all to be accessed in the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid. But
Thank you.
I only know about the one in Cartagena, which to me seems quite rich. At the same time, I find it hard to compare to, let's say, the Inquisition archives of Saragossa in Spain. So it's not easy to because I know those are very well kept. So it's hard for me to compare.
Thanks. And just a minor question, but I really liked the 3D picture of Fleurenburg, and I wondered who had done that.
Oh my, that's a good question. I don't think it was in particular for Jewish Amsterdam, but this is let me see where I found this. I found this a few years ago. It's somebody in the Netherlands who took this initiative, but it's remarkably detailed. Really, you
Yeah.
go from house to house.
Exactly. No, it was a very impressive image. I can look it up. I just wondered if it was something you were familiar with. And one last question. It looked to me on some of the maps you showed as if they were reverse orientated. In other words, it looked as if north was at the bottom of the maps. And was that the case?
Yeah, in particular the one of Cayenne,
Yeah,
because you're looking north from the Caribbean, north from the Atlantic to Cayenne, which was often the case with maps in the 17th century,
and
16th,
also the
17th.
Mauritsstadt and Recife one. It looked as if it was inverted.
Yes,
Okay. I just wanted to be sure that I wasn't misreading it. Thank you. And thank you again for a fascinating talk.
you're welcome.
Arnold?
Yeah, thank you again. Thank you for. I have actually read your book about the Dutch moment. So that was a fascinating book, and also it shows how hard actually it was. It seems to have been a very hard 30 odd years for the Dutch, probably. Yeah, and so I'm always trying to chase family things. Now, one of the things I've noticed, and I don't know if you've come across it. A person called Vieira, who was I believe, was commander of the Portuguese when the Portuguese took Recife. Is that correct? And do you know if he was Jewish or had a Jewish connection?
Well, I think the commander of the Portuguese fleet that conquered Recife in 1654, which then leads to the conquest of all Dutch people, I think his name was Barreto, Barreto. You probably refer to, well, there are two Vieiras in this period. One is a cleric, Antonio Vieira, and the other is leader of Portuguese guerrilla fighters against the Dutch, and his name was, I believe, João Fernandes Vieira. Is that the
Right.
one you mean?
Well, I don't know. My grandmother was called Vieira, and she lived in the Portuguese community of Amsterdam. And so I'm just interested to make a connection, if there is a connection. And
Well, what I do know, because I do know a few people called Vieira in Portugal, and they always tell me that it is one of the most common names in Portugal.
yeah,
Which would probably mean that, there must be
Yeah.
a Jewish branch and there must be a much larger,
Yeah.
Christian club of people called Vieira.
Yeah. I see. Also, and the last one. Did you come across the name Toro at all in your researches in Curaçao or in Recife?
Touro,
Yeah.
Touro. Oh yes, I've come across it, and of course we have the Touro synagogue in Newport, Rhode
Sure.
Island.
Sure. But
Yeah, no,
I'm
certainly. Yeah.
interested in the South American connection there, because I know my connection to Isaac Toro. He's my great uncle, effectively. But I'd love to find out more about the Toros of South America. And I don't know where I would look. I've tried.
Of South America. Do you mean Brazil or
the islands, Curaçao,
okay,
Suriname, anywhere really.
the Caribbean?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know by heart. I mean, the go-to book for Curaçao is always The Jews of the Netherlands Antilles by Isaac Emanuel and his
Right.
wife Suzanne Emanuel.
Okay.
This is a fantastic, rich 2-volume book where with a great index as well. So that would be a book to immediately go to the index for and see what Turos there lived in Curaçao. I don't know by heart.
Okay. Okay. But thank you very much. That's I enjoyed your lecture. Thank you.
Ron Gomez Caceres wants to pose a question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And first of all, my compliments to. It's always a pleasure to listen to the depth of information that Wim Klooster always, talks about and shares with us. So thank you, Wim. I thought I would miss this call, but I'm glad I was on time. I want to say a couple of things. One is there are tourists that are buried in Curaçao in the old cemetery. Difficult to find the exact grave because the inscriptions have disappeared. But there is a direct connection between Curaçao's Toros and those that started the synagogue in Rhode Island. So that's one comment. The other comment, I loved hearing about Bayonne. And I should just add something personal there. The direct ancestor of the Gomez Castros family in Curaçao came from Bayonne, actually fled Bayonne to flee the Inquisition and ended up in Curaçao and doing business from Curaçao with a brother of his in Bayonne. And until the 1970s, there were still Gomez Castros living that were direct family members in Bayonne. If you go to the Holocaust Museum, also you will find a number of Jewish Gomez Castros from, among others, Bayonne, that were killed during the Holocaust. And a lot of them, or some of them, definitely two of my family members, were actually engaged in the chocolate production. There is a book by Rabbi Prince, Deborah Prince, in which she mentions, she specifically discusses Jews and chocolate in Bayonne. And it's a very interesting subject and not a very deep one, but a pleasant one and a delicious one to be reading about. So I just want to pass that on. So I actually think that to David's question, I have a feeling that there is availability of information in Bayonne because there have been at least Jewish descendants there. Rather, like I said, until the 1980s. My father was there in the late 70s and met then still living family members. So I have a feeling there's probably more there than I've never researched it, but I have a feeling that there is something to be found there.
Well, interesting you bring up Bayonne because one man that I've been studying a lot in depth, I keep coming across him in the Amsterdam Material Archives. His name is Aaron Gabay Faro. His father, he was born in Amsterdam in 1637, but his father had been born in Portugal, had moved to Bayonne, and there's an inquisitorial file in Madrid about him, which I still have to get. But knowing about these communities, it's not just Bayonne, it's also Saint-Jean-de-Luz, which is nearby. It's that southwestern corner of France, which is fascinating. Also made me think I should one day see what might be available in the archives of Bayonne. And we'll see. But so it's on my list as well.
Interesting.
This was the last person who wanted to raise his hand. Shall we wrap it up, David?
Yes, I think so. Thank you. It was an excellent presentation.
Yes, thank you very much for giving this lively talk. It's a very nice overview of the history of Jews in Latin America and Caribbean America. Thank you very much. This was Sephardic World, brought to you by the Sephardic Genealogical Society. As always, we are thankful to our patrons who support us and who are here with us today. And as always, we hope to see you again in 2 weeks' time. And thank you, Wim Klooster.
My pleasure.